I think some people are still coming on. I'm Richard Howorth from Square Books, and I want to welcome you to our Crossroads book discussion event for this month. Some of you know that we've been doing this since shortly after the murder of George Floyd, trying to use books to have discussions about race, essentially. We've got a good one set for today. We started this, I think the first book we did was How to Be an Anti-Racist, and that was with Barbara Phillips and Ruth Odell. Then Eddie Glaude with Kiese Lehman on Eddie Glaude's book, Begin Again. We did a young adult book with Afton Thomas and LaToya Falk, The Only Black Girls in Town. And I think next month, I don't know whether this is going to be a Crossroads selection, but I think it is, yes. Stuart Stevens, who's former Republican campaign manager and a member of the Lincoln Project, who wrote It Was All a Lie, is going to be in conversation with Marvin King from the University of Mississippi Political Science Department. But today, I'm very happy to have Connor O'Neill as our guest. He's written this book, Down Along with That Devil's Bones, A Reckoning with Monuments, Memory, and the Legacy of White Supremacy. Just a fascinating book, and where he chases these Nathan Bedford Forrest statues all over creation, and just a really well done book that's published by our friends at Algonquin. He'll be in conversation with Brian Foster, who teaches here at the University of Mississippi sociology and Southern Studies, and I'll give you all a hot tip. He's got a book coming out in December that I hope we can have. We'll have some sort of virtual program, some kind of program for I Don't Like the Blues, Race, Place, and the Backbeat of Life. There it is, published by the University of North Carolina Press. I'm very excited about that. And before I turn it over to y'all, I obviously should mention that we have signed copies of this available at Square Books. Thank you both. I'll turn it over to you guys, Connor and Brian.
Cheers. Thanks for
Yeah, thank you, Connor. As we were saying, I'm happy to be doing this with you.
Man, likewise.
A, because I love the book. B, we've got some other interesting parallels. But speaking of the book, I want to kind of begin at the beginning, the very beginning, the cover page. Down Along with That Devil's Bones, A Reckoning with Monuments, Memory, and the Legacy of White Supremacy. We'll get to the kind of subtitle, the monuments, the memory, but the first part, Down Along with That Devil's Bones. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about where it comes from. Where did you get that title?
Yeah. So, writing this book, it's structured in 4 parts in 4 different cities, 4 different monuments, which meant a lot of driving time. And if you're like me, you get into a kind of fugue state, especially in late night drives. Your mind starts to, make strange connections. Things are bubbling up. You spend too much time looking out the windshield. And it was driving back late at night from a reporting trip in Murfreesboro, which is one of the cities that I write about. And it just kind of popped into my head. That devil, the phrase "that devil" comes from General Sherman. That was what he called Forrest during the Civil War. There was a student activist in the 1960s who was protesting Middle Tennessee State's use of Forrest imagery and Confederate imagery, and said this great phrase, we should have the good sense to let his memory stay buried along with his bones. So I had that phrase kind of rattling around in my head. There's also a Lucinda Williams song, Down Where the Spirit Meets the Bone. Anyway, like I said, it's things get weird on late night drives, and somehow or another, all that kind of coalesced. in my head, and out came Down Along with That Devil's Bones. So I guess that's kind of a long way of saying it's a bit of a nonsense title. I promised my editor, I'm sorry, Betsy, that I would come up with a more succinct explanation for that title. In exchange, they'd let me keep the title. And they let me keep the title, but I never got a real succinct answer. So I've got a long answer for a long title, but yeah, it's all about the journey, I guess.
Two things real quick. Some of my better and many of my worst writing ideas came while driving, have come while driving. So I sympathize with you there. And number two, everything I've ever written, like the title has 10 different kind of stories and layers of meanings to it. So we are kindred there. You mentioned the driving and the cities. So the book starts in Selma and then goes to Murfreesboro, goes to Nashville, then goes to Memphis, and we end in Montgomery. And you say on the very first page, right, to start the prologue, I've been changing the story of Nathan Bedford Forrest, and you describe kind of this journey through these different places. Many different times you describe it as a chase. I wonder if you could say more about just kind of the motivation for this chase, for this road trip, as it were. Kind of what motivated it, like kind of what pushed you into it, and how would you characterize it? Like how do you think about kind of if we zoom out a little bit, like how do you think about the whole of it?
Yeah. So I mean, it was it really started. I had this very strange encounter on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. I had this run-in with this neo-Confederate group there, and the dissonance of that, the so-called Friends of Forrest, encountering them on a day when, I was in town to mark this anniversary of civil rights violence and struggle, and President Obama was there to give a speech, and the sort of whiplash that I experienced meeting this neo-Confederate group, it really threw me for a loop and stuck with me. And so I thought, okay, I'll write about Selma, and it would be one place. It'd be a little bit about Forrest, it'd be what it meant to put up a monument to him in 2015, and it would be about this one place. But soon after that, just a couple months after that, of course, was the Charleston 9 murders. And Dylan Roof had gone on this sightseeing tour before he had went to Charleston, as a way almost to kind of steel himself for this act of terrorism that he was about to do. And so in the wake of that, there are protests everywhere. And so I decide that I'm going to follow the protests on Confederate imagery and symbols based on Forrest particular. So in a literal way, it's a journey, right? Because I'm going to these different places. I'm a journalist by trade, so I'm going to places, I'm talking to people, and there's that exterior movement. But what became really powerful about it was that the more I talked to these people on both sides of the issue, whether these monuments should stay up or come down, and what they meant, it became clear that I wasn't going to be able to do this in this sort of old school, objective, detached, third person approach. And so it became an inward journey too. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I didn't really know much about the Civil War, knew hardly anything about Forrest, and honestly had some pretty naive ideas about how race worked in America. Yes, I was studying the civil rights movement and thinking about issues that were being raised by the movement for Black Lives at the time, but it all felt kind of abstract. I didn't have a personal stake in it. Like I said, kind of naively, the received wisdom growing up was sort of like, insofar as race is still a problem in America, it's a problem for Black people. And brave people like Dr. King marched and helped us get over this. But so what a lot of that inward journey was coming to terms with the way that race had shaped my life too. and not just in the sort of trying to weigh someone's heart and deciding if they're a racist or not, but seeing that the way that race has been used throughout American history, before the Civil War, long after the Civil War, race being used as a way of hoarding opportunity, resources, wealth, safety. And so that was all prompted by, I sort of came in through the back door looking at a particular Civil War general and moving to the South to realize this, but getting at these bigger ideas of how race continues to shape and mangle lives in America, and mine as well. So, you know, at first I thought, you know, well, I find Forrest repellent, the Confederacy, but what I realized was that the work and the journey was to understand my proximity to it, that like I had a stake in this too, and that I was benefiting from the sorts of battles that Forrest was fighting to continue to structure American society to the benefit of white Americans. So that's the journey, that's the internal journey, is coming to terms with that and really understanding my place in this.
I want to stay there. There were, I don't know, probably a handful of moments when I was reading where I was moved, or something in me moved, whether it was sort of like melancholy or sadness. I'm thinking about the scene at Calvary, the church scene, which maybe we'll get to, and other emotions too. One of the times when I was moved was at your first mention of, or when it first became clear that you were writing, at least in part, to an audience of white folks, and you were situating yourself in that audience. You use the language of us and we and our. Just to give an example, you know, you say, and this comes early in the book, so American life encourages white people to take our whiteness for granted. And there are dozens and dozens of examples of you locating yourself in the story, in the journey. Well, I want to talk about the whiteness side, the lessons that you learned and the lessons that you think your book or the story of Nathan Bedford Forrest, kind of what lessons we might learn about race and whiteness from those. But first, just maybe quickly or not, I'm wondering about the process. Like, I'm wondering at what moment you realized not just that you were a part of this story too, but that you wanted to locate yourself, like in terms of the writing, like, oh, I'm actually going to have to include, I actually want to include myself in the story on paper, right? So I imagine there's a moment where you realize that you know, there's an education happening as you're doing the reporting. I just wonder if you could talk either a little bit about that, but also the decision to translate that into text.
Yeah.
Like, was there something that happened? Was there a moment that you can point to, that sort of thing?
Definitely, yeah. Two of them stand out in particular. The first one came when I was up at Middle Tennessee State in Murfreesboro. Over the 2015-2016 academic year, students on campus organized this really incredible protest movement to try and get the school to change the name of Forrest Hall, the ROTC building on campus. It's named after Forrest. Over the history of that school, they've had tons of Confederate symbols on campus, including in the 1960s, their mascot was a student who dressed up as Forrest and would ride a horse on the sidelines of the game. And so part of the reporting process there involved talking, you know, with student activists at the time, soon after the school had integrated, trying to get the school to change the, you know, mascot, get rid of some of those symbols. But it also involved a lot of time in the archive, looking at pictures from yearbooks. And I had this moment in the basement of this library where I saw the mascot, a picture of the mascot, and he looked incredibly like Forrest, that he was a good match for him. But then it dawned on me, like, 6'2", 185 pounds, cold blue eyes. I'm wearing my hair a little shorter now, but like scraggly beard. It dawned on me, like, oh, I would have been, if I had been at MTSU in the 60s, I would have been the mascot. and that's a little bit what I was saying earlier. Like there were these moments where I was invited to consider not my distance from Forrest or not my distance from the Confederacy, which is convenient. Again, especially for a Northerner, we love to feel like everything is just down there, someone else's problem. But it was one of those moments where I was invited to consider my proximity to it, and that, you know, this was all done for my benefit, right? Like to continue to structure this country in a way that tilts the board in my favor. So a moment like that was powerful. Like a legit spit take in that archive. Apologies to the librarians at MTSU. But yeah, so a moment like that realized like, oh, there is some internal identification happening here. And it's an internal identification that I don't want to be making, that I was scared of making because it's unflattering, and it sort of puts me on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of the present in a lot of ways. And because it felt uncomfortable, then I knew like, okay, I got to keep digging here, and this needs to be a part of the book. The other big one that stands out was reporting in Selma. Real quick, the backstory there. In 2000, the city of Selma elects its first Black mayor. And, you know, this is Selma, synonymous with Black voting rights. And the week that he's inaugurated, a group puts up a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, and that comes to sort of dominate his first term as mayor. And so when I start looking into this story, I'm reporting in Selma. I'm trying to get him to talk to me because he seems central to the story, and he just didn't want to talk to me. He wouldn't answer my calls. I went to his door. I talked with other family members, just like persistent, trying to get it. And finally, he returns a call, and we have this long sort of pre-interview conversation. I remember I was on the second floor of the Selma library, which is where everyone does like genealogical research. So it's a bunch of white people trying to sort of get their, going through all the history of, the city and the county, which is very important to them. And I was at one of the tables, having a kind of laying my soul out a little bit to him, because he basically, Mayor Perkins wasn't really interested in talking to me about what it meant to him that this statue had gone up in his first week in office, unless and until I could talk about what it meant to me that this statue went up, which is to say he wanted to know that I had sort of understood that I had a stake in this too. And I wasn't just kind of parachuting in and writing about this sensational story, but that I was realizing that I couldn't be objective about this, that the issues that led to that statue going up were issues that were impacting my life too. And if I wasn't aware of them, he wasn't really gonna talk to me. So I had the conversation there at the library on the phone with him, sort of laying out that connection, that stake in it. Got some very strange looks from some of the people doing genealogical research there. But again, it was one of these moments where it became clear that even just the process of reporting this book, I was getting pulled in. I was getting pulled closer. And so I knew that the book, like the actual writing of the book, had to reflect that too, that I had to interrogate myself if I was going to interrogate Forrest.
So let's kind of go back and walk toward what I hope can be a healthy kind of conversation about whiteness and race. But let's begin at the beginning with Forrest. This is an impossible question, but like, what is his story? What's 60% of the folks here know who Nathan Bedford Forrest is, but don't know many details beyond that. So to the extent that you can do so neatly, what is who was Nathan Bedford Forrest? Like, what is his story? And yeah. Just one more sort of prelude to the question. You say it was Forrest who taught me the meaning of whiteness in America. So I want to get to your, this meaning of whiteness in America piece, but let's start with Forrest. Who was Forrest? What is the Nathan Bedford Forrest story?
Yeah, I think his life moves west with the country in a lot of ways. The way that he grows up is how the country reflects a lot of the changes that are happening in the 19th century. So he's born in Middle Tennessee in 1821, moves as, after the last Indian treaty is signed and the Trail of Tears takes place, his family's able to move into the Delta, and he eventually becomes a slave trader in the city of Memphis. And Memphis is really the inland epicenter of the slave trade, the sort of the so-called Second Middle Passage. So after the end of the transatlantic slave trade, a million enslaved peoples come, from the upper South down into the plantations of the deep South, and Memphis is really the doorway there. So he becomes incredibly rich, by some accounts of one of the richest men in the South, as a slave trader in Memphis. He uses some of that fortune to equip his own cavalry troop when the war breaks out. Obviously, he has an immense financial stake in perpetuating slavery. But he enlists as a private. You can understand him sort of in contrast to someone like Lee, who went to West Point, the sort of Southern gentleman, one of the first families of Virginia. Forrest is kind of a nobody. You might say he got rich by pulling himself up by his bootstraps, but of course he got rich by trafficking other people. But yeah, so he distinguishes himself as a savvy military mind. He starts getting promoted over the course of the war, but he's fighting in the Western theater of the war. He's not up with Lee. He's not at Gettysburg. And so he becomes, after the war, a sort of like what could have been. If only Forrest had been given a more prominent role, maybe the South would have won. So, over the course of the 20th century, a lot of neo-Confederates start to turn to Forrest more because he can sort of carry the burden of, the people who are vowing that the South will rise again. Forrest kind of becomes their guy. But after the war, he serves as the first Grand Wizard of the Klan. He operates a convict leasing plantation in President's Island, just off, in the river in Memphis there. So really at every sort of turning point of his life, he's really bound up in these touchstone moments of, racial reckoning, really. So yeah, that's his life. And then of course his afterlife, like I say, is, on the one hand, people despise him, rightly so, for the systems that he was involved with. Slavery, the Klan, convict leasing, it's known as slavery by another name. But he's also honored by some white Southerners because he's this, sort of blue collar, both sort of everyman, but Superman at the same time. And again, sort of the Monday morning Confederate quarterback looks to him as the general who could have won the war. So that's his story.
You say on 192, there's this really, what I thought, powerful quote that kind of captures the ways that folks saw Forrest then, but then across time, right? We see, this is a book about 4 monuments in 4 cities. We see the ways that Forrest continues to kind of live on now, and how many folks continue to imagine him and his importance and stature. You say, I won't give the story, but a man essentially says to his kid, the man you just saw dying will never die. And in some ways that's proven true. I wonder if you, I don't know if you want to focus on a particular city, we talk broadly, but one of the things that I found fascinating, and I think what makes this a really important book, is that you spend a lot of time and talk at length in a lot of different kind of contexts with folks on both sides. As much as I hate that phrasing, mm-hmm. But you give us these really powerful stories of the folks. I think it's Joshua Crutchfield and Tammy Sawyer and so many other folks on the front lines doing the agonizing and important work of, from my perspective, important work of organizing to have these monuments removed. But then you also talk to the folks, the friends of Forrest, so forth and so on. that perspective, the Friends of Forrest perspective, we get a lot of here. I wonder if you could talk about that, some of those conversations, the things that kind of move you the most as you were putting this story together. What were you hearing from the folks who wanted the monument to stay in Selma, and who want the monument back in Memphis, and all of those places in between? What's the rationale? What justification? What are some of the things that you heard, or some of the interactions that you had that you think might be instructive to us, right? I'll never have the type of conversation you had with those folks. So what are some things that you might be instructive for us?
Yeah, so some of the defenses that they recite, slavery was legal at the time. You get a sort of whataboutism in a lot of it. 11 of the 13 presidents owned slaves. The Klan wasn't that violent, or that he disbanded the Klan. Defenses that don't have a ton of stake, or a ton of grounding in solid history, but that are much more emotional. I think that, as one person explained it to me, he's sort of Tennessee's legendary soldier. He's their idea of a hero, and I think at a deeper level. This is generalizing a bit, but it was certainly true for me, and I think it's true for some of the people that I talked to too. I think white Americans have a pretty naive idea of how to use history in their lives. I think that our ideas of American exceptionalism, this is the greatest country, these ideals of liberty and freedom, in some way sort of entitle us to a good history, to a happy history. And so in a weird sort of reverse logic, then the people who are our heroes can't be bad. Our history has to flatter us. And so if Forrest's part of our history, then he must flatter us. And so that ideology sort of teaches us then to emphasize the parts of his life that we want to find admirable and not talk about the other stuff. So I think that's a lot of how he gets remembered, at least in public. I mean, it's hard to think it's a coincidence that there's so many monuments and markers that are counties, cities, state parks, streets, schools, in addition to all the statues that are for the first Grand Wizard of the Klan. Like that maybe doesn't get talked about in public a lot, but I think that is rippling under the surface everywhere. And so, I think that's you start to learn the playbook that they're talking from, and I heard a lot of the same stuff reporting in these different cities. What was more surprising and more interesting was the way that they would interact with me. Now, some people were pretty skeptical. I mean, just trying to report anything these days in the kind of era of fake news is challenging. Something as controversial as Forrest and Confederate monuments, all the more so. So some people were pretty skeptical of me. Well, plenty of people told me to get lost. But then other people talked to me, I think because they thought they had a good shot of getting me on their side. And that understanding why they thought that became important for me. One guy gave me a stack of pamphlets that included a thing that said, "Forrest fought for you. Will you fight for him?" And at the outset of working on this project, it was really easy for me to think like, "Oh no, Forrest didn't fight for me." But again, coming to see just all of the wealth that was extracted from the system of slavery that built the economy of the entire country, the ways that we, from everything from buying a home to funding our schools, how I'm treated in interactions with police officers, like so much of my life has been shaped by these notions of race that was made most explicit by the Confederacy, right? The Confederacy is the one who goes out there and says in their documents, in their speeches, like, look, we think Black people are inherently inferior, and we're going to build our country on that idea, and we're going to just tell it to anyone who will listen. So the Confederacy becomes a really stark and clear way of seeing what is a much broader American project. And so I came to see like, oh, damn, Forrest really did fight for me. Like, you know, whether I like it or not, and even if I'm only participating in these systems passively, like he was working to uphold this tilted board that was going to send things in my favor. So this idea that like I could be a mark for them, they could convince me to appreciate what Forrest was doing, because he was doing it in my name to a certain extent. And I think they understood that and tried to give me the hard sell. Obviously, you know, I find Forrest and his legacy abhorrent, but I also found it instructive. It taught me so much about how race operates, how inequalities are perpetuated in this country, and how we all have a stake in that. So a lot of that reporting was, again, just like the stuff that I wanted to turn away from became the stuff that I really had to square to.
The short version of this next question, and it's related directly, I think it follows all of this commentary that you just offered. The short version is, what is at stake? What do white folks, like, let's just, right, what do white folks think is at stake, specifically with these monuments and symbols that are tied to this part of the country's history? What is at stake? I wrote an essay about the campaign to remove the state flag from the campus of the University of Mississippi some years ago. And the essay is unimportant, but other than a piece of reporting that I did in talking to the Black women who were at the forefront of that movement, one of them, her name is Dominique Scott, other is Tyson Marino. But Dominique reflected with a lot of pain and emotion on death threats, on you know, there's a day that there was a demonstration on campus. There's a better word than demonstration, but there's an action on campus, and then there are whispers that some of the counter protesters, the Confederate sympathizers, have guns on the campus. She threatened, right? So it's, and then you talk about Sylvester Brooks at MTSU, and you talk about Joshua Crutchfield and Tammy Sawyer, and there's folks feel like, it seems, the Friends of Forrest, so forth and on, feel like that if this monument is moved, something will be lost. If my flag can't, if the state flag can't be on campus, something serious and deathly is going to be lost. Mm-hmm. What is that? Based on those conversations you had, you get at the answer to this question in so many different places. It's one of the reasons why I like the book so much, is that it feels honest. It feels honest. What is at stake? What do folks think is going to be lost? Or what place does Nathan Bedford Forrest and all of these monuments to him, and then to others, there are a couple of monuments in Oxford, right? What place in white identity and consciousness do those things hold that will make them want to kill somebody to keep it here?
I think it's about prerogative, and it's about control, a sense that this is, quote unquote, our country. This is a white man's country, and that are the white male heroes from our past who colonized this country, who quote unquote built this country, who extracted the wealth that we use to make it a booming economy, and that who, you know, in everything from the Homestead Act to FHA loans to the GI Bill to the Social Security Act, like, we're gonna protect ourselves and give us this wealth, this opportunity. The monuments are a reflection of that this is ours. And it is ours by dint of our heroism, our bravery, our unimpeachable ideals of freedom and liberty. and that I think in a deeper way that the past doesn't have any hold on us, that there's no, there can be no counter narrative. There can be no challenge to the heroism of the white man's country, even if it needs to be through, you know, keeping control through minority rule, through voter suppression, through war on drugs, you know, whatever it is. Like, this is our country, and we intend to keep it that way. And these monuments are public reminders of whose, literally, like, whose space this is, whose land this is, who it's meant for. I think that's what was really revealing about the Unite the Right rally, is that over the course of a couple of years of monument protests that were happening mostly in the South, it's those monuments, as they started to come down, started to work on an almost kind of symbolic logic that this, you know, the Confederacy into whiteness. And so if the Confederate statues were under threat, some kind of white prerogative was under threat. So you get militias, Proud Boys, neo-Nazis from Indiana, from the West Coast, from New York, you know, from Ohio, that what might seem on its face like a Southern issue really became an American issue because it was about this white entitlement. And I think what we're seeing now is that white people who want to protect that entitlement are having to sort of ask for it or be much more direct about it. I mean, this is what it gets trotted out about the Trump administration, that they're saying the quiet part out loud. That for so long we've found subtle, more pernicious ways of maintaining a racial hierarchy in this country. And now it's sort of bubbling to the surface. And these Confederate monuments, I think, have been a way of exposing that there is a deeper sense of a white identity that is tied to them, and that a lot of white people in a lot of places feel like they have a stake in it. Yeah. So.
And so what is a question that my students ask me, that I get a lot, that I hear a lot when I met, you know, way back when we could do this in person, questions that I hear at during these kinds of events, mostly from white folks, at least when the question registers in this way, mostly from white folks. It's well, what do we do? So what can I do? What should I be doing? You again, I'm trying to plug your book as much as I can. You give us a lot of that, and in specific and concrete terms, at a few different points in the book. What would you offer to those folks wondering, in particular to those white folks wondering what to do, how to counter some of this that you just outlaid? What do we do? What's next? How do we get through it?
Yeah, I think part of it is just like talking about whiteness. Like it is shaping so much of our lives, but we let it go unremarked upon so often. And there really, like, there is no biological basis for whiteness. It is a political category, political in the sense of, like, you know, a hierarchy of power. So the more that we can talk about it, the more that we can see it operate, and the more we can try and untether whiteness from the supremacy that it was invented to perpetuate. So seeing it, naming it, talking about it, looking where the power is, and trying to address it. But I think in a deeper way, you know, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but we are in the 11th hour right now in so many ways. And I think, you know, this is a country that has a 10-to-1 racial wealth gap, a pandemic that is exposing through the disproportionate death among Black Americans, the inequities in our healthcare system, the value gap that plays out in everything from housing to education to, you know, environmental catastrophes. All of those break down along lines of race. And so if we want to address that, these are massive policies about, you know, addressing mass incarceration, addressing the unequal distribution of wealth. I mean, huge, complicated policies that sorely need redressing. But before we can do any of that, I think we need to come to a common understanding of our past and understand how that past has led us to these drastic and violent inequities that we have in our country right now. And if we can get to that common understanding of the past, understanding the legacy of slavery and how it's been perpetuated since, then maybe we can build a consensus for putting forward policies that might, totally rethink how law enforcement works, or whether it's useful in our communities at all, ending mass incarceration, having healthcare for everyone, getting an equal distribution of wealth, equal access to land, to funding our schools in different way. I mean, in every facet of our lives, we need seriously rethink from that 30,000 policy level. But to do it, we need that consensus, and we need to have a common understanding of our past that is not rooted in a need for that past to flatter us, but to be honest about where we've come from and how that continues to shape our present. So yeah, just being, getting over those sort of naive ideas of American exceptionalism and being honest about the Confederacy, being honest about colonialism. I mean, being honest about this country, who it's meant to protect and afford opportunities to, and who pays the price for those.
Was that someone else?
This is Richard, Brian.
Come on in, Richard. Yep.
Okay. Yep. Saying my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me okay?
You're a little choppy, but we can hear you.
Okay. I just want to introduce a question from a member of the audience to Connor. You very effectively used Forrest and the monuments to deconstruct the ideas of whiteness and to see how race, place, and commemoration are interconnected. Now that the Mellon Foundation has its Monuments Project, what is it you have learned from the project that you think the Monuments Project should be thinking about? And Brian, you're welcome to answer that too.
I hope that we can get away from the sort of monuments of individuals and the sort of great man of history framework that supports those individual monuments. I mean, I had an incredibly moving experience at the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, more colloquially named as the Lynching Memorial. That's a very dynamic memorial. You're moving through it. It's changing as you move through it. It's ideally sort of meant to change you and reorient your sense of America's past. I think more dynamic, more community-based memorials. I think are the way forward. I don't know. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I was trying to find a quote that I had pulled from down the long, which essentially said, and this is kind of, I guess, one thought that I have, but the quote, and I think you were quoting someone else, that essentially said that, like, symbols, in this case monuments, and it's one thing that I appreciate about the book, like, they don't just grow out of the ground, they don't fall out of the sky, right? They're situated in a particular, like they stand for something, that is, I think, inextricable from, like, not able to be disconnected in, like, the broader place context, whether we're talking about Selma or Memphis or Nashville, or whether we're talking about the US. The fact that we have a country where these monuments and statues and building names and so forth and so on are everywhere. We can find them from Washington State to DC that says something about the history of this country. Mm-hmm. And I think, kind of to your point, like, until we can get to a point where, like, we can talk honestly about that history. And importantly, I think, until we can get to a point where white folks can talk honestly about that history as something other than dispassionate observers from the sidelines, whether it's folks who think racism is only something that happens to Black people, and oh, what can I do to help those poor Black folks out? Or even in conversations about monuments, statues, buildings, names, until we can get to a point where white folks feel that what is at stake for people of color also implicates them, if that makes sense. Like for me, that's any conversation about monuments, any monuments project, I think has to call folks in, from both sides, is that phrase that we like to use so often, into honest conversations about the country's histories, about the country's history, about, you know, Oxford's history, about Nashville's history, so forth and so on. So yeah, I mean, you know, I could ramble on more, but one thing that was coming to me as you were talking, and that I do think applies to wherever the conversation about monuments and Confederate iconography goes from here. I think one part of that, to your point, Connor, is and I think we need more than talking. We need more than dialogue. But I do think that if folks can get to a point where they can think about and speak honestly about like what these symbols, like the broader context that birthed these symbols and how they are implicated in their history, even if they don't want to be, even if they weren't trying to be. I think any wherever the monuments, you know, debate goes, I think that if it's going to be healthy, if we're going to see any progress, I think that honest accounting of history has to be a part of it.
Thank you, guys. I've got to wrap this up, and thanks for just an excellent conversation. Brian, we look forward to your book coming out. I Don't Like the Blues. I hope we can do something with that. And Connor, thank you so much for doing this today, but really big thanks for writing this book. I know you put a lot of work into this and a lot of thought, and it's just a marvelous read. And to all our listeners, I thank you. I know some of you have been to these Crossroad events before, and thank you for keeping up with it. And I should say that you can get down along with that Devil's Bones at Square Books. You can get a signed copy there, and you can get it at your local library. Okay? Thanks, and good evening to everybody.